Hello, I'm Molly Arthur with EcoBirth, Women for Earth and Birth, and I'm going to tell you a little of my story and how I explored my lineage, my maternal lines, and now work to save my legacy to my children and grandchildren, and in the process found my true place in life as a guardian for future generations. When I was raising my children, I thought all I needed to do was to raise good children and everything be okay. When they were grown, I realized that the outside world in which they were conceived and now live, and in which their children will be raised, had drastically changed to include hazards that I knew next to nothing about. I started to look around for what had happened to the world in the last 30 years on my watch. I started with my own family, my own home, and my desire to understand what could have allowed such alterations to our natural cycles and our earth and ourselves. How could I have allowed harm to be perpetrated on my children? I wanted to know how my immutable relationship to the women before me was important to my self-realization and identity, and what lineage was I part of, and was I protecting my legacy for my future generations? I realized it mattered where I lived, but also it mattered where my mother and grandmother had lived too. And it came to me, I was in my grandmother's body as an egg, in my mother's body in 1912. Good grief, 100 years ago, amazing. And affecting 2 generations. I started to search for what could have been happening in the environment in San Francisco then, because it actually could have affected me, and I might pass it on to my children and grandchildren, 2 more generations. I'm a 6th generation Californian. My family has been 5 generations right here in San Francisco. So I thought I should look at what influence being in this specific place might have had on my ancestors and possibly on me and my children and grandchildren. My grandmother's named after her mother, who was the first Catherine Connor and the only daughter of Patrick Edward Connor. My family is prominent in San Francisco society still. White privilege and social ascendancy, grabbed by my immigrant ancestors in the founding of San Francisco, countered their origins in a colonized and starving Ireland. We reveled in our Irish clannishness. My best friends were my cousins, and we grew up within blocks of each other in Pacific Heights in San Francisco. We went to the same private girls' Catholic school that our mother and grandmother and all their sisters went to. And understanding of place is a major part of my story. In Northern California, starting with the gold rush in 1849, mercury was used extensively in hydraulic gold mining in order to help capture gold. So was mercury in my ancestors' drinking waters, perhaps their food, and perhaps in their bodies? This heavy metal has been correlated with birth defects and lower IQ. It's called a neurotoxin and can permanently affect our health. The mining and the gold rush are San Francisco's story and my family's story. My great-great-grandfather was credited with pioneering the efforts to extract the mineral wealth of what is now the largest man-made excavation on Earth, the Bingham Canyon Mine, just outside of Salt Lake City, Utah. His story has become a major opening in my consciousness. My lineage contains a legacy intrinsically tied to the ripping open of the earth and the poisoning of it. The first thing I realized was that my legacy was not just genetic, but environmental too. Then I started understanding the effects of this kind of endeavor, the extraction of minerals in mining and smelting, and its connection to oppression, death, war, and that it was related to my ancestry. I learned that more than pollution was being perpetrated on me and my children and grandchildren. Ourselves and our souls are in peril, tainted with our own ancestors' heritage of genocide and pioneering of the most toxic influence on the world, mining. In the summer of 2010, I elicited a promise from my 26-year-old daughter to visit this site. What connections were we visiting in our legacy? The heartbreaking beauty of my daughter versus what I had passed on to her and what she must live with now can make me weep. This speaks volumes to me about our misguided way of producing instruments of death from the freely available resources of our Mother Earth, and how I must understand my family's collusion with it. My great-great-grandfather Connor was honored as the best Indian killer in the Western region in the 1860s, even by Mark Twain. I took a trip to Utah to visit the site where the largest single Native American massacre in the U.S. was perpetrated by Connor and his soldiers at Bear River, Idaho in 1863. Connor personally allowed his soldiers to slaughter the village, rape women, and kill babies. It was a horror which is still felt by descendants of the tribe and memorialized by them every year at the site. I feel there is some connection between this dark and ugly shadow in my ancestry and the modern afflictions that have been manifest in my family and are such a part of our culture and society now. I was understanding the vicious cycle of destruction of the earth by mining, creation of weapons of war, and the killing of others, with poisoning and violence continuing to be passed on through generations. What of our future generations, my children and grandchildren? This was getting very personal. The obelisk memorial mentioned combatant women and children. What on earth could that mean? That women would fight back? Their homes were being burned and children killed? Of course they would. That is the fierceness of the connection of mothers and their babies. I relate to that ferocity. It drives me. It's the foundation of my mission now in my life. To honor and see the sacredness of that relationship through EcoBirth, connecting our birthing in our primary home, Mother Earth, to our maternal lines, past and future. So this is where my grandmother grew up in San Francisco, at 1800 Golden Gate Avenue, where another heavy metal toxin enters my family story. I discovered the U.S. history of lead paint starting in the 1880s and wondered about whether the well-documented effects of lead could be seen in us. I think my grandmother's right there on the stairs. My grandmother and her 7 siblings were probably born at home, right on that corner of Masonic and Golden Gate, with the support of caregivers, midwives, who are guardians of our natural birthing rights. My immigrant Irish ancestors came to San Francisco in 1849, and they originally ran a paint store. So the older the paint, the more lead is in it. So all the lovely Victorians in San Francisco would be full of lead paint, and my ancestors would have made money from that. In the same year my grandmother was born, U.S. medical authorities diagnosed childhood lead poisoning. These heavy metals can permanently affect our brains, nervous systems, and kidneys, which can create effects like learning disabilities, attention deficit disorder, and speech, language, and behavior disorders. I had a growing realization of my family's collusion and its privilege built on a history of destruction, poison, and war. This certainly was not what I wanted to see or to pass on to my children. But I was drawn to discover more and to think further about my mother's generation. In 1913, my mother was born in San Francisco. She was the oldest of her family and always the favored child by her parents, and she took on the mantle of guiding our extended family from her mother. So my mother's birth was in one of the first hospitals in San Francisco. There's the building, still there at Broadway and Van Ness, the co-op now. In the U.S., midwifery was discouraged when the obstetric industry was growing, starting at the turn of the century. So 50% of babies were delivered by midwives in 1910 in the U.S., but only doctors could prescribe drugs. So hospitals and the medical industry made tremendous inroads in maternal care. My grandmother was probably given morphine and scopolamine, as women of a higher social class were enthusiastic about this new offering at that time, because they could afford the hospital fees and wanted to be above a bodily, lower-class breastfeeding. So these drugs erased any memory of the birth, but not the actual labor sensations. So frequently, the birthing women were tied to the bed to prevent thrashing around. But her body would remember, wouldn't it? This is a prime example of the insidious oppression that women and babies encounter in our culture. And what is the inheritance of this traumatic kind of birthing, passing from generation to generation? This is the crib that my grandmother told me she kept close by her bed so she could pat her babies to sleep, comforting them when they cried. She was given that crib by her mother for her first baby, my mother, Molly. Now I realize that that crib was undoubtedly painted with lead paint. My Grammy wrote in my mother's baby book, see there at the bottom, my baby's basket, white enameled wicker. Mining and lead paint, I was seeing a convergence in my history, straight to my ancestors' business endeavors and into our bedrooms, and intimately into our bodies. Oh, the mining industry loved this. The connection between mining, its digging out of lead, and use of mercury as a byproduct became clearer to me in my search for what was creating the poisons in our world and how my family and ancestry was intimately tied to it. During my mother's lifetime, the larger biosphere's poisoning accelerated with persistent mercury because of the growth of industry, and along with the lead of our cars' gas fumes, entered our water and air and soil, becoming an integral part of our life environment, our ecosystem, our life system, our Mother Earth. And the war machine in manufacturing, which started in 1869 in Hunters Point in San Francisco, added extraordinary and deadly toxins to our local environment. A direct connection to the mining industry and my family's military history. More convergence was arising in my consciousness. None of these relatives are alive now, but I have inherited from them not just a small shade of red in my hair and a sprinkle of freckles, but their environments and life histories. My male ancestors made livings that supported their families and allowed us the privilege of economic and social success in our society, but their type of living, mining and selling lead paint, were also passing on effects unintended and involuntary. And I have to reconcile this part of my personal history. I realize that none of us are immune or protected from our histories, and it is better to know what is in that history, name it, and claim it as a part of ourselves, and no longer be ignorant of what we are doing, so we can better move to create a better world. I just recently thought about my lineage of doctors. My uncle, grandfather, and great-grandfather were all doctors. My great-grandfather was the first native-born California doctor in the state, and my grandfather had been chief of staff of St. Mary's Hospital in San Francisco, where I was born. In those days, standard procedure in our local hospitals, tying the woman down to the gurney, gassing her. My mother said she was happy to be unconscious, put out. Now, I consider taking drugs at birth comparable to voluntarily ingesting toxins like alcohol and smoke, which can have immediate effects on my baby and possible long-term effects, just like we are discovering with these ubiquitous pollutants around us. So you need to be drugged and unconscious to put up with this kind of torture, tied like an animal. And so how do we understand this kind of persecution just for birthing women? The horror of this torture, which affects our women bodies and our baby's entrance to this realm. There is no respect in using these stirrups to immobilize a birthing woman. Her body is not a machine. It has its own natural capability, and too often it is treated like a diseased throwaway to be cut, drugged, injected. If you are drugged, you cannot naturally deliver, working with your contractions, so forceps may be needed. There are implications to this kind of birthing that can have a lifetime of effects on our baby's health and well-being. The stress of these kinds of births can have physiological and psychological effects through generations. No one in my generation was breastfed. These are the instructions given out by the hospital on preparing a formula of the right mixture of dextrose and condensed milk, including a note, "You may continue to give your baby irradiated carnation milk, after weaning from the bottle. Pretty ironic when I realized that cow's milk, sugar, and lead from the canned solder seen here, instead of my mother's naturally, perfectly evolved breast milk, were what I got as a baby. Making a business out of what is freely available. A most intimate love offering, now for sale with poisons in it. An imitation of our maternal milk could never replace the real gift from a mother to her child. Our babies need that milk to grow their bones and brains. I think that every baby should come into this world with eyes clear, connecting to a receiving gaze of love, and be fed from her mother's pure milk. This is nourishment and nurturance. What about these man-made interventions like mercury and lead, which poison our earth and our food, our bodies and sustenance, and can affect our health? Tainting a mother's body and breast milk, then passing it on to her precious baby. I can say very clearly it is very, very wrong. My mother did not know there were toxins in this precious crib, handed down from mother to mother. There I am in the crib, and I wonder how has my maternal line been tainted? By the structural violence of torturous, unconscious birth? By the involuntary, unknown toxins in our ecosystem? By the loss of our souls from the generational perpetration of harm? But the next shocker for me was learning about a new toxin invented in 1921, when my mother was just 9 years old. A new perfume was developed that is the most popular perfume of all, Chanel No. 5. I know that this perfume was a persistent part of my mother's life because there was always a bottle on her vanity, and she dosed herself with it before her frequent social forays. And I received my own bottle from my mother as a gift, as a rite of passage to adulthood, and it still has an honored spot on my bureau some 30-40 years later. Phthalates, the chemical in Chanel No. 5, is a synthetic chemical, mainly used as a plasticizer, and besides being in perfumes and most any product marked with the word fragrance, were introduced to my home in baby products such as baby powder and lotion and shampoo, and marketed through that new wonderful little TV box, and has been connected with hormone disruption that is correlated with early puberty of girls and cancer and obesity, and in particular can affect fetuses. My sister was born with a bone birth defect. She did not grow a fully formed left hip bone socket, hip dysplasia they call it. She had a cast on her legs for 18 months of her babyhood there on the right to help form her hip bone. It worked well, but I think now that she had an inherent weakness in her bones from possible influences during her gestation. She could have been affected by a hormone disruption like too much lead or mercury while she was in utero, particularly in the first trimester. You can see this graph showing when a hormone disruption could in particular affect the skeletal bones, her bones, that circle there. My sister really was the most beautiful and funny and intelligent, creative member of our extended clan, but her potential was stunted and ended much too young. She died at age 52 of bone marrow cancer, with lesions throughout her bones that broke them. So she was born during World War II. Oh, so many influences from the war manufacturing here in San Francisco, and the heritage of mercury and lead, and maybe the phthalates during her lifetime. Plus all the toxins used during our childhood. My sister also had early onset puberty, which is correlated to cancer later in life. And my sister suffered from obesity, which has been linked with a common hormone disruptor loosed in our lives since World War II, one of the over 80,000 new chemicals developed in my lifetime and used without any proof of safety. So I had to release my angry judgment on my sister during this family exploration when I realized the extraordinary involuntary influences that may have been the causes of her life challenges, and that probably she was not just weak and incapable of making life-saving changes to improve her health, but that her obesity and addictions were influenced by her external environment, over which she had no control, and that her death could be connected to her original bone weakness. Certainly she had no control over her mother's and grandmother's environment, and she had no real control over the stresses that her birth defect, early puberty, and mental illness created in her life. These stresses create the physiological environment for disease, and traumatic events can trigger these vulnerabilities, like her possible rape in the Peace Corps, and her reaction to my mother's death, which seemed to precipitate her final disease. My mother had breast cancer when she was only 38 in 1951, when I was a baby. An unusual event in those days, but not now, it seems. Could this be a result of the mercury and lead which surrounded my grandmother when she was expecting my mother, or tied to the phthalates in her favorite perfume, or to the stresses of living during World War II, or to the lack of breastfeeding us 3 children, which is associated with increased risk of breast cancer? How are our vulnerabilities expressed? By the various addictions that 80% of my generation of extended family suffers from. We have been afflicted with addictions to drugs, alcohol, tobacco, sugar, and flour. Where have our souls been lost? What healing can we find in this modern separated world, disconnected, hurting, unaware of our inherited oppressions and internal yearnings? In 1985, my daughter was born at a birth center with a new version of a midwife in California, a certified nurse midwife. During her birth, I didn't use any drugs and felt this was the most self-empowering and inspiring moment of my life. I was so lucky to have the care and support to birth my child as I knew my body could. But I needed that sheltering love of my husband and the guardianship of my labor nurse to help me feel safe and capable. Here's my child in the same precious inheritance from her great-great-grandmother. My mother put new bunting and satin interior on it for her first grandchild. I fear the implications of what I perpetrated on my children through my personal culpability and ignorance, and an entire system that is obliterating our fellow kin and destroying our natural connections with our ancestors and descendants. The brain drains nutrients from the bones to grow. Women's bones need to flex to birth. I ask, what power do you have when you cannot prevent your child's bones from becoming deformed? What is really going on here? Well, I was getting pretty overwhelmed by this ubiquitous harmful products in our lives. All the new great products sold to us in our favorite TV shows, now in my children's baths and food. Are we just as ignorant as my ancestors were? Are we passing this harm on to our children and grandchildren? For how many future generations? Can we clean this up quickly enough to change our legacy? Now I was getting to the current situation. During my daughter's lifetime, there has been increasing chemical production and therefore more pollution released in our environment and life system, our home, our eco. Mining is still the largest polluter. Wow. But we have been the guinea pigs for the safety of these chemicals. We are pre-polluting our babies on a trial run whether a chemical was good for us or not. We had to prove it was bad for us by losing our health. We need to use precaution first and prove that new chemicals being introduced to our lives and bodies are safe. Pesticides in our food are neurotoxins that explode the insect's nervous system, first developed in Germany by the Nazis. Wow. So our poor food is cheaper because it is industrialized food. Monocultures, pesticides, chemical full. It's because of these toxins there is a lack of nutrition in our industrialized food. Everyday consumer products have toxins in them, mostly unregulated by our government. I cleared out so many of them, and it took some time for me to even realize what I should be throwing out. I'm continuing to do so. I finally got a new organic mattress. I wonder now about the hours and hours my daughter spent on soccer fields, undoubtedly covered with pesticides. We need to guard the next generations from these possible harms. It is their inherent right to live in a world free from our creation of thoughtless hazards and poisons. Very recently, an article came out with research showing that GMOs are in babies in utero. The altering of the very foundational components of our lives, the poisoning of our food in the seeds and soil, the free gifts of our Mother Earth, really gave me pause, because I learned that we could be compromising the structural integrity of our bodies and bones and brains. Could that be affecting our capability to birth naturally? And there are too many interventions to this most unmysterious result of human evolution, bringing life into the world. Babies are subjected to increasing numbers of cesarean section deliveries, 30% plus in the U.S., and antibiotics, both which seriously hinder the child's ability to culture the essential flora in its gut for a lifetime of health. These children are at a higher risk of developing allergies and asthma later down the road, as well as other chronic conditions including ADHD, autism, and obesity. I see birth as the metaphor for transformation and creation that, if honored, will create a paradigm shift in our culture's consciousness. We life givers have an inherent right to birth the way we want to, with fully informed and conscious consent. My precious baby should not be born with the predisposition to illness or overburdened with toxins, particularly through my body. Her body and spirit need my body and my love to grow, and she needs a clean world in which to be healthy, and she needs to live and grow in an eco-home system of care and protection, not destruction and oppression. I carry this story. I embody this story. I have the tinge of red hair that Connor had, the freckles of my Irish genetics, which I have passed on to my children, but I also pass on the oppression, mutilation, the epigenetics of toxins, and the darkly hidden shadow on our souls. There is an abiding linkage that I can see between the male bloodthirstiness to kill the other, the drive to dominate with weapons of destruction mined from the earth, with the living to make a profit that poisons our children, with the embodiment of our man-made poisons that we pass on to 2 generations. The forcing of women to birth in trauma, with the unconsciousness that convinces them that they need drug chemicals to do the most natural act of life. And the human-altered fake food, adulteration of our Mother Earth's freely given life force in her seeds and soil. The compelling consumerism. We need more stuff to answer our empty souls. We sell our work, lives, and our children's health too cheaply. Low oppressive wages, using up Earth's resources that poison our air, water, and soil to make tainted, cheap goods that we can then afford to buy. It's a vicious cycle. It was becoming clearer to me what was happening to me, my children, and to our Mother Earth. I recognized my culpability and its relationship to all parts of my life, including my lineage and now my legacy. I was seeing our hubris in altering the very basic life force in our world with no thought for harmful effects. I was seeing that I am a part of the destruction of the connections that are intrinsic to our beautiful system of life here on our precious Mother Earth. This was a difficult but heart-opening journey for me, exploring my personal environmental story. I realized that my healing will come from recognizing the inherent right of our entire life holistic ecosystem to function as it innately does, with care and love
nourishment and nurturance. I will not deny my ancestry, but I will know who I am now, and I will help create my new family story that will pass on that beautiful caring and loving to our future generations. This will give my life meaning and hope and healing. I will honor my ancestors and resolve to pass on to my children and grandchildren a purer world. I will be a companion to those trying to make a better world, and I resolve to be a guardian of future generations so they can call me a beloved ancestor. So I just heard of research that said a mother's laughter makes her breast milk healthier for her baby. There really is nothing more miraculous than that. We can change the world with love and laughter, and it will respond with health, happiness, our true place in it, and a healed legacy. I was given this name EcoBirth, and I am following its lead to talk to women about their conscious awareness of their own personal environmental story, just like I've told you. And EcoBirth will train women to be guardians of future generations and work to recognize the inherent rights implicit in a whole and functioning beautiful life system in our world.